I'm Carol Bacak-Egbo, historian for Oakland County Parks. Join me now for an episode of History in Our Parks. A sailor, a widow, and Comerica Park. A Red Oaks County Park story. I set out to discover something about the history of the land that would become Red Oaks County Park. I started to look at the old farms. I started with the Dawson farm. I found out that that farm was owned by James Dawson in the 1850s. He died in 1864, and he left the farm to his son Edwin. Edwin wasn't able to take over the farm. That's because he was serving aboard the USS Forest Rose during the Civil War as a sailor. When the war ended, he did return home and ran the farm. In 1871, he married Elizabeth Matilda Norris, who always went by the name Matilda. I noticed, however, in 1872, Isaac Dawson, his brother, had taken over the farm. What had happened to Edwin and Matilda? I wanted to find out. I found them in 1880 living in Pontiac. But there was some confusion in the census records. Matilda Dawson, aged 27, was listed as the head of the family. Edwin Dawson, aged 37, was listed as her son. Clearly mistakes in the records. I did, however, learn that they had a daughter by then, young Mabel. 1890, of course, those census records aren't available. The 1890 records burned in Washington. The next record I was able to locate for them was a city directory from Detroit from 1897. But I was only able to locate Matilda. She was listed as the widow of Edwin Dawson. It seemed like sometime before 1897, Edwin Dawson had died. I was curious. How was she supporting herself? It would have been very difficult for a widow during that time period. Well, that led me to a Detroit Free Press article. That was an article about someone who was found dead in their bed in a boarding house. That boarding house happened to be run by Mrs. Matilda Dawson. Her boarding house would have been located just outside the gates of Comerica Park. Then there was a problem. I located the death certificate for Edwin Dawson, but it turned out he didn't die until 1919. That was over 20 years after Matilda had declared herself a widow. He was even living in Detroit. He was living at 445 Rademacher. I found out that he was buried in Roseland Park Cemetery, there on Woodward Avenue. I had to know more about Edwin. I went back in time, located him in 1910. He was living with his brother Isaac, but something interesting. For his marital status, there was a D, which stood for divorced. It appeared that sometime in the 1890s, Edwin and Matilda Dawson had divorced, and from that time forward, she had declared herself a widow. In 1920, Matilda was still living in Detroit, but this time she was living with her daughter Mabel and her son-in-law. Interestingly enough, she was living at 445 Rademacher. That was the same address where Edwin was living when he died in 1919. So had they reconciled? Were they back together near the end of their lives? Those answers will not be found in a death certificate or a census record. We may never know. But one thing I do know, Matilda was also buried in Roseland Park Cemetery. So was she buried next to Edwin? That's going to take a trip to Roseland Park Cemetery. Now see the problem here, though. I was trying to locate the history of the farms that became Red Oaks Park. I hadn't even finished the Dawson farm. And there were all these other farms to think about. There was the problem. I had started off in a direction, but then I had veered off course. History often does that to you. But that can be a good thing. Because sometimes when you veer off, you find a really good story. A story that might even include a sailor, a widow, and Comerica Park.